Daniel Harper slammed his fist on the steering wheel so hard the horn blared. And he didn't care. He was already 20 minutes late. Already soaked. Already a man running from his own reflection. But then he saw her. A woman in a wheelchair, alone in the pouring rain. One wheel jammed in a sidewalk crack. Her umbrella torn inside out by the wind. He could have kept driving. Every logical part of him said, "Keep driving." Instead, he threw open the door. He had no idea that single impulsive choice would change everything. He had no idea she was about to turn his entire world upside down. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you're new here, hit subscribe. You don't want to miss what happens next. Daniel Harper had been living like a man waiting for permission to disappear. Not in any dramatic way. No one would have noticed from the outside. He still packed his son's lunch every morning. Peanut butter, no jelly, because Marcus had decided jelly was for babies ever since he turned 7. He still showed up to work on time, answered emails, said good morning and have a nice weekend, and all the things that make a man look like he's functioning. But somewhere underneath all that routine, underneath the alarm clocks and the grocery lists and the parent-teacher conferences, Daniel had quietly stopped believing that anything good was still coming for him. His wife, Rachel, had been dead for 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days. He didn't count on purpose. It just happened. The way grief happens. Not like a wave, the way people always said, but like a stone lodged permanently somewhere behind his sternum. Some mornings he woke up and forgot, just for a second. And in that second, everything was fine. Then he'd roll over and see the empty side of the bed. The pillow he still hadn't moved. And the stone came back heavier than the day before. He was 44 years old. He owned a small accounting firm. He had a son who drew superheroes on his homework and asked too many questions about heaven. And he had a sister named Carol who had, apparently, decided that 3 years was long enough. "It's one dinner, Daniel." That was how she'd framed it 2 weeks ago, standing in his kitchen with her arms crossed like she was his mother instead of his little sister. "One dinner," he'd repeated, "with a stranger. With a person, a real human woman. Her name is Isabella. She works in... Actually, you know what? I'm not going to tell you anything because you'll find something wrong with it before you even give it a chance. Carol. She's been through a lot. You've been through a lot. You're both in the city. You both love jazz. I'm not asking you to marry her, Daniel. I'm asking you to eat food in the same building as another adult." He'd said yes mostly to get her out of his kitchen. But somewhere between that conversation and tonight, he'd started to wonder if maybe Carol was right. Marcus had asked last week, completely out of nowhere, while they were watching a baseball game, "Dad, do you ever get lonely?" And Daniel had said, "No, buddy, I've got you." But the question had burrowed into him and stayed there. So here he was, dressed in his good charcoal blazer, hair actually combed, driving through downtown Cincinnati on a Thursday evening in October, while the sky fell apart above him. The rain had started around 6 and escalated with a commitment that felt personal. By the time Daniel was circling the block near Rosario's, the Italian restaurant Carol had chosen because, as she said, nobody has a bad first date at a good Italian place. His wipers were losing the argument, and his phone was showing him a text from the restaurant confirming his 7 o'clock reservation, which it was now 6:53, and parking was nowhere. He finally found a spot 2 blocks away, which meant by the time he jogged to the restaurant, he would be damp at best, completely soaked at worst, and either way, not particularly impressive. He was halfway out of the car, jacket pulled over his head like a tent, when he saw her. She was maybe half a block ahead, on the sidewalk across the street. A woman in a wheelchair, electric blue raincoat, dark hair plastered to her face, and one wheel had dropped into a gap between the sidewalk and a raised metal utility panel. She was trying to reverse, but the angle was wrong, and the wet pavement gave the wheels nothing to grip. Her umbrella was already inverted, purple fabric blown inside out, handle still in her hand like she was refusing to surrender it. No one else was on the street. Daniel stood there for exactly 4 seconds. He was already late. He was already underdressed for the rain. The restaurant was 1 block in the opposite direction. He thought about the reservation. He thought about Carol. He thought about the very specific social awkwardness of showing up to a blind date 20 minutes late and soaking wet. Then he thought about nothing, because his legs were already moving. Hey, hold on, I've got you. He crossed the street at something between a jog and a sprint, rain hammering his shoulders, and crouched down next to the stuck wheel before the woman could respond.
The back wheel. If you go forward slightly, it'll...
He had his hand on the frame, tilting it just enough to free the wheel from the gap. There! The wheelchair rolled free. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The rain was loud. A car hissed past on the wet street. Then the woman said, in a voice that was remarkably composed for someone who had just been stranded in a downpour, "You didn't have to do that." Daniel stood up. He was completely soaked now. His blazer had done nothing. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. She was somewhere in her late 30s, maybe 40. Dark eyes, sharp and careful, the kind that catalog things quickly. The blue raincoat was good quality. She had a laptop bag across the back of her wheelchair that probably cost more than his first car. And despite the fact that she was sitting in the rain with a busted umbrella, there was something in her expression that wasn't helpless. It was more like annoyed, but trying to be polite about it. "I know I didn't have to," Daniel said. "That's usually how helping works." She looked at him for a moment. Then something in her face shifted. Not quite a smile, but close. "Fair point," she said. "Thank you." "Daniel." He held out his hand, and then immediately felt absurd because his hand was dripping. She shook it anyway. "Isabella. You heading somewhere nearby? Because I can..." He glanced around. The rain wasn't letting up. She had no working umbrella and no obvious shelter. "I have a pretty useless jacket, but it's better than what you've got." Isabella looked at her inside-out umbrella. "That is a low bar." "I'm a low bar kind of night, apparently." She laughed, a short sound, surprised out of her, like she hadn't expected to. Then she said, "Rosario's, on 5th. I have a reservation at 7. Daniel went very still. "You have a reservation," he said slowly. "At Rosario's." "Yes." She looked at him. "Why are you making that face?" "What face?" "That face. Like I just said something extremely strange." Daniel put his hand over his mouth for a second. "I also have a reservation at Rosario's. At 7. Isabella stared at him. He stared back. "Carol," they said at exactly the same moment. Isabella's eyes went wide. "Your sister is Carol Harper? Your physical therapist is Carol Harper? She told me she was setting me up with someone who worked in finance. She told me the woman's name was Isabella and that we both liked jazz." Daniel pressed his fingers to his forehead. "I should have known. She's been trying to do this for 8 months. I should have known she would..." He stopped, looked at Isabella. "I'm sorry, I know this is not what either of us signed up for." "My therapist set me up on a blind date," Isabella said flatly. "That's what I signed up for. The bar is already subterranean." "That's fair." They looked at each other through the rain. Then Isabella said, carefully, "Well, we're both wet, and we both have reservations. and I am very hungry." Daniel looked at her. Something about the way she said it, matter of fact, no self-pity, just pragmatic, made him exhale for the first time in what felt like hours. "Okay," he said. "Let's go to dinner." The interior of Rosario's was warm and close, all dark wood and candlelight, the kind of place that smelled like garlic and good olive oil, and made you feel, walking in, like someone had been expecting you. The hostess, a young woman named Bree, according to her tag, had looked from Daniel to Isabella with practiced neutrality and led them to a corner table with enough room to maneuver the wheelchair comfortably. They ordered drinks, water for both to start, because they were both driving. Then Isabella ordered red wine after looking at the menu for 30 seconds, and Daniel followed because at this point, why not? For a while, neither of them spoke.
Not awkwardly. It wasn't that kind of silence.
More like two people who were genuinely exhausted and had silently agreed to let the restaurant do some of the heavy lifting. Then Daniel said, "How long have you been working with Carol?" 8 months, Isabella said. "She's been my PT since the accident." She said the accident in the same tone someone might say the traffic on I-71. A fact, not an event. But Daniel caught the slight tension in her jaw before the sentence was finished. "If you don't want to talk about it," he said, "that's fine." "It's fine," she said. "Car accident, 14 months ago. The driver ran a red light at about 50 miles an hour. I was a pedestrian." She picked up her wine. "I broke my pelvis in 3 places, fractured 4 vertebrae, and the spinal damage was..." She paused. "They said I might regain some function. I'm still working on that." "I'm sorry," Daniel said. He meant it in a way that wasn't polite noise. He meant it the way you mean things when you've had your own version of the accident. When you know that some days those 2 words are the only honest thing anyone can say. Isabella looked at him. "Don't make the face," she said. "What face?" "The pity face. I can tell when it's coming." "I wasn't..." "Your eyebrows went up and your chin went down. That's the face." Daniel deliberately relaxed his expression. "Better?" "Marginally." He picked up his own wine. "I wasn't pitying you. I was just..." He thought about how to say it. "I know what it's like when someone uses that word to fill up space. I wasn't doing that." Isabella looked at him more carefully now. "Carol mentioned your wife." "Of course she did." "She mentioned she passed 3 years ago?" 3 years, 2 months. He caught himself. "I don't count on purpose. It just..." "Sticks," Isabella said quietly. "Yeah." He set the glass down. "Yeah, exactly." The server brought bread. Neither of them reached for it immediately. "What was her name?" Isabella asked. "Rachel. Something about saying her name in this place, at this table, with this woman he'd met 20 minutes ago in the rain. It felt strange and also, somehow, not wrong. She was a middle school art teacher. She used to bring home her students' drawings and put them on the refrigerator next to Marcus's, so he wouldn't feel... She said every kid's art deserved a refrigerator. He stopped. "Sorry, that's..." "Don't apologize," Isabella said. "Tell me about her." He looked at her. "I mean it," she said. "Everyone always gets this look like they're waiting for you to stop. Like grief has an expiration date and you've run over yours." She turned the wine glass slowly in her hand. "I had a fiancé before the accident. His name was Kevin." Her voice stayed even. "He lasted 6 weeks after I came home from the hospital. Said he couldn't..." He said a lot of things, actually, but they all meant the same thing. Daniel said nothing. "So," Isabella continued, "if you want to talk about Rachel, talk about Rachel. I'm not going anywhere." Something shifted in Daniel's chest, something that hadn't moved in a long time. "She made terrible coffee," he said. "Like, catastrophically bad. I don't know how she did it. It's 4 ingredients. But every morning she would make a full pot and drink it herself and act like it was normal. And every morning I would pour mine down the drain and make a second pot when she wasn't looking. Isabella laughed, a real one this time, not the surprised half sound from outside. For how long? 11 years. You never told her? I told her once. She cried. Not sad crying. She was laughing so hard she cried. She made me show her what she was doing wrong, and then the next morning she deliberately made it worse, just to— He stopped. His throat was doing the thing it did sometimes. Just to make me laugh. Isabella was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite name. Not pity. Not the face he'd told her not to make. Something quieter. She sounds like someone worth missing, she said. She was, he said. She really was. The food came. They ate. The conversation moved the way conversations do when two people have stopped performing. Easier, less careful, with occasional silence that didn't need to be filled. Daniel learned that Isabella ran a corporate consulting firm called Meridian Strategy Group. That she'd built it from nothing over 12 years, starting as a one-woman operation out of a studio apartment with a laptop and a second-hand printer. That she had 19 employees now, and clients in 6 states, and had been in the middle of closing the largest contract in her company's history when the accident happened. And you still ran it, Daniel said. It wasn't a question. From the hospital bed, she said. I had a project manager try to send everyone home for a week, and I called him from the ICU and told him if he touched my client files, I would find a way to fire him from Traction. Did he believe you? He knew me well enough to know that I absolutely would. She broke off a piece of bread. Some people told me I was handling it wrong, that I should focus on healing, not work. But work was— She considered. Work was the only thing that was still the same. Everything else was— She gestured slightly at the wheelchair. Everything else was completely different. But Meridian still needed me. And I still knew how to run Meridian. Daniel understood that in a way he felt bone deep. After Rachel died, work had been the same thing for him. The numbers didn't grieve. The spreadsheets didn't look at him with concern. His clients needed their quarterly reports, whether he was destroyed inside or not. And that consistency had been not comfort exactly, but structure. A rope in the dark. My son asked me last week if I get lonely, Daniel said. Isabella looked at him. He's 7, he said. Smart kid. Maybe too smart. He doesn't miss much. What did you say? I told him I had him, and that was enough. He paused. I meant it when I said it. And also, I knew it wasn't entirely the truth. Being a parent, Isabella said quietly. I always assumed I'd— She stopped. Kevin and I were going to start trying after the wedding. I was 38. We both knew we were already pushing it a little. She looked down at her glass. The accident was 8 days before the wedding. The table went quiet. Outside, the rain was still coming down. Daniel could hear it against the restaurant window. A low, steady sound, like the night itself was thinking. Isabella. He waited until she looked up. For what it's worth, and I know this is a strange thing to say to someone you met in a rainstorm 20 minutes ago, I think you're extraordinary. She raised an eyebrow. You say that to all the women whose wheelchairs you unstick. You're the first, actually. Low sample size. Still counts. She looked at him for a long moment, and then, slowly, the corner of her mouth curved up, and it was the first time all evening that she looked like someone who believed she might actually be okay. You're not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? Carol said you were quiet and responsible and good with numbers. She tilted her head slightly. She forgot to mention the part where you're funny. I'm not sure I'm funny. You're funnier than you think you are. He picked up his wine glass. Now who's being kind? I'm not being kind, Isabella said. I'm being accurate. There's a difference. She lifted her own glass. Carol said you were the best man she knew, and Carol is annoyingly honest. Daniel looked at his glass. She says the same thing about you. Isabella blinked. She said I was the best man she knew? She said you were the strongest person she'd ever worked with, that you had more fight in you than anyone she'd ever met. He met her eyes. She said she wanted to introduce us because she thought we'd understand each other. I thought she was just meddling. But he stopped. But? Isabella said. I think she might have been right. Something moved across Isabella's face. The careful composure she'd walked in with, or rolled in with, he corrected himself, had softened around the edges. She didn't look fragile. She still didn't look fragile. But she looked real, in a way that hit Daniel somewhere he hadn't expected. I haven't talked about Kevin like that in months, she said, almost to herself. Not to anyone except Carol. And even then, it's always in the context of, how does it make you feel? What's your coping strategy? Are you processing? She made a small sound. Nobody just lets me say his name and sit with it. You can say it, Daniel said, as many times as you want. She was quiet for a moment. Kevin wore the worst ties, she said finally. I mean, truly offensive. He had this one with little cartoon sharks on it that he wore to every single important meeting because he said it was his lucky tie. And I would tell him every time that it was not a lucky tie. It was a liability. And he would say, She stopped, and her voice was doing the thing now, the thing Daniel recognized. He would say, Izzy, I have never once lost a deal wearing this tie, so the data supports me. Daniel said nothing, just let it be there. I threw it away, she said quietly, 6 weeks after, right before Kevin left. I put it in a garbage bag with a bunch of other things and She exhaled. I've regretted it ever since. It was ugly. It was so ugly. But it was his. I still have Rachel's coffee mug, Daniel said. The one she drank from every morning. It's got a chip in the handle and a coffee stain that I've never been able to get out. I've washed it 100 times and it's still there. He looked at the table. Marcus asked me once why I keep a broken mug. I told him it wasn't broken, just worn. He thought about that for a second, and then he said, like people. Isabella stared at him. He's 7? He's an old soul. Rachel always said that. Isabella pressed her lips together. Her eyes were bright. Daniel. Yeah? I'm really glad your wheel got stuck in a crack in the sidewalk. He laughed. A real one. The first real one in longer than he could remember. It came up from somewhere deep and surprised him. I'm really glad I was running late, he said. They stayed until the restaurant was half empty, and the candles had burned low. And Bree came by to ask if they wanted dessert for the 3rd time, and they finally said yes, just to stop being asked. They shared a tiramisu and argued amiably about whether the espresso was too strong. Daniel said no. Isabella said absolutely. And at some point, Daniel realized he hadn't thought about the empty pillow or the stone behind his sternum in almost 2 hours. That felt significant. It felt like something. They split the check despite Isabella's protest that he'd already done her a favor, and the least she could do was, "The least you can do," Daniel said, "is let me pay for half of a dinner that neither of us technically planned." That's not how the math works. I own an accounting firm. I'll decide how the math works. She handed her card to Bree, with an expression that said she was letting him think he'd won, which he recognized was not the same thing as actually winning. Outside, the rain had slowed to something thin and cold. The street was wet and gleaming under the lights. Daniel walked beside Isabella's wheelchair down the block toward the parking structure, their breath making small clouds in the October air. "Carol's going to be insufferable," Isabella said. "Completely insufferable," Daniel agreed. "She's going to remind me about this for the rest of my life." "Mine too." "She's earned it, honestly." Isabella glanced up at him sideways. "Marginally." At her car, a modified sedan, hand controls, parked in the accessible section on the first level, she turned to face him. The light in the garage was harsh and ugly, but she didn't look any less composed in it. She seemed to be choosing carefully. "This was not what I expected tonight to be." "Better or worse?" "That's not a fair question." "I'm asking anyway." She looked at him for a long moment, the careful eyes, the jaw that had been set all evening and had only slowly, gradually, over soup and pasta and terrible-sounding coffee and ugly ties and a broken mug and a 7-year-old's unexpected wisdom, finally relaxed. "Better," she said. "Considerably better." Daniel nodded. "Good." He paused. "I'd like to do this again, if you'd want that." "I'd want that," Isabella said. She held out her hand. He shook it. And then, without exactly planning to, he held on to it, for just a second longer than a handshake required. And she didn't pull away. "Good night, Daniel Harper," she said. "Good night, Isabella." He walked back to his car. The rain had stopped completely now. The sidewalk was dark and reflecting the lights back up at the sky. And Daniel realized, standing there, that he felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days. He felt like tomorrow might be interesting. He got in the car. He sat there for a moment. Then he texted Carol. "You're still insufferable." 3 seconds later, his phone lit up. "Does that mean it went well?" He looked at the screen for a moment, then he typed, "It went well." He set the phone down, pulled out of the space, drove toward home, toward Marcus, toward the apartment with a coffee mug with a chip in the handle. He didn't know yet that tomorrow morning, when he arrived at work, he would walk through the door of his office building, step into the elevator, press the button for the 14th floor, and when the doors opened, he would see Isabella Reyes sitting in her blue motorized wheelchair behind the desk at the end of the hall. The desk with a company name etched in glass on the wall above it. Meridian Strategy Group. The largest client his firm had ever taken on. He didn't know that yet, but the night had started with a wheel caught in a crack in the rain, and a man who almost kept driving. And sometimes, that's exactly where the rest of your life begins. Marcus was already awake when Daniel got home. He wasn't supposed to be. It was past 9:30, and the babysitter, Mrs. Ellison from 4B, had strict instructions about bedtime. But there he was, sitting on the couch in his dinosaur pajamas, with a book open on his lap, like a tiny professor who'd been waiting up to deliver a verdict. "You were gone a long time," Marcus said. "It was dinner, bud. Dinner takes time. Mrs. Ellison made me go to bed at 8:30. He said 8:30 the way someone might say solitary confinement. I couldn't sleep. Daniel sat down next to him. Mrs. Ellison had already gathered her things and slipped out with a knowing look and a quiet, "He was fine, just restless." Now it was just the two of them in the living room, with the lamp on and the rain-wet city doing its thing 8 floors below. "How was it?" Marcus asked. "It was good." Marcus studied him. 7 years old, and the kid had his mother's eyes. Not the color, but the quality, the way they didn't let you hide. "You look different," he said. Different how? Marcus thought about it with the seriousness he brought to most things. Like when you figured out that puzzle, the one with all the blue pieces? Daniel looked at him. Less stuck, Marcus said simply, and went back to his book. Daniel sat there for another minute, not saying anything. Then he put his hand on top of his son's head, the way he had since Marcus was an infant. And Marcus leaned into it automatically, the way he always did. And for a moment, the apartment felt not full exactly, but less empty than usual. He got Marcus to bed. He made himself a cup of coffee. Good coffee. His coffee. The real kind. And stood in the kitchen in his rain-wrinkled blazer and thought about a woman with careful eyes and a broken umbrella, and the way she'd said, Kevin, like she was handing something fragile to someone she'd just decided to trust. He went to bed eventually. He didn't lie awake long, and in the morning, he woke up before the alarm, which hadn't happened in longer than he could remember. He drove to work with the radio on. He stopped at the good coffee place on Elm, the one he only went to on Fridays, even though it was Thursday. He was in a good mood, in the specific, cautious way of a man who doesn't want to examine his good mood too closely, in case looking at it makes it disappear. The building that housed Harper Accounting was on 5th and Meridian, a 14-floor glass tower that he'd moved into 6 years ago when the firm outgrew its original space. He had the whole 9th floor now, 11 employees, good clients, a corner office he'd worked a long time to earn. He took the elevator up. He got off on 9, said good morning to Jenny at the front desk, poured coffee number 2 in the break room, went through his morning the way he always did. Emails, calendar, the Whitmore Group quarterly he'd promised by end of week. It was Jenny who knocked on his office door at 9:45. Daniel, the Meridian Strategy Group is here for their onboarding. He looked up from his screen. They're not supposed to be here until next week. They rescheduled. Didn't you get the email? He clicked over to his inbox. There it was, time-stamped yesterday at 4:17 p.m., while he'd been sitting in traffic trying to find a parking spot near Rosario's. Meridian Strategy Group. Onboarding rescheduled. Thursday, October 12th, 10 a.m. He'd missed it. Tell them I'll be right up, he said. Up? Jenny looked at him. They're on 14. They asked us to come to them. He paused. Meridian is on 14? They moved in about 3 months ago. The whole floor. She tilted her head. You didn't know? He hadn't known. He'd taken Meridian on as a client in August, handled entirely through emails and a brief call with their CFO, a precise woman named Dr. Park who spoke in bullet points and expected the same in return. He'd known it was a consulting firm. He hadn't had a reason to know what floor they were on. Right, he said. Give me 5 minutes. He straightened his jacket, picked up his portfolio, rode the elevator up 5 floors with the professional composure of a man who had absolutely no reason to feel the way he was currently feeling, which was something between anticipation and dread, and a third thing he wasn't going to name yet. The 14th floor was different from his. Cleaner lines, the kind of minimalist design that cost a lot of money to look like it cost no money. A reception desk of pale wood and black metal, and behind it a young man who smiled and said, Mr. Harper, Ms. Reyes is expecting you. Conference room A, just down the hall. Ms. Reyes. Daniel had not, at any point in the last 12 hours, connected the name on his client file. Isabella Reyes, CEO, Meridian Strategy Group, with the Isabella he'd met in the rain. It hadn't occurred to him. Why would it? There were a lot of Isabellas in Cincinnati. And when Carol had described her setup, she'd been deliberately vague. She works in... Actually, you know what? I'm not going to tell you anything. He understood now why Carol hadn't told him anything. He walked down the hall. The conference room had a glass wall. Through it, he could see a long table, 4 people seated around it with laptops and folders. And at the head of the table, Isabella. She wasn't in the blue raincoat. She was in a charcoal blazer over a white blouse, her hair pulled back. A pair of reading glasses he hadn't seen the night before perched on her nose. She was in the middle of saying something to the man beside her, gesturing at a document with a pen, and she looked not different exactly, but assembled in a way that the rain hadn't allowed for. She looked like someone who ran a room. She looked like someone who ran the building. She hadn't seen him yet. He stood outside the glass for approximately 3 seconds longer than was professionally reasonable. Then he pushed open the door. Every head at the table turned, including hers. Isabella Reyes looked at Daniel Harper. She went very still. The pen stopped moving, and for a single, suspended moment, the entire conference room held its breath without knowing why. Then she took off her glasses. "Mr. Harper," she said. Her voice was perfectly composed, professionally warm, not a single crack in it. "Thank you for coming up. Please, sit down." He sat. He opened his portfolio.
He was aware of 4 sets of eyes around the table, and he was aware that his face needed to do the thing faces do in professional settings, which is express appropriate alertness and nothing else. "You've met our CFO, Dr. Park," Isabella said, gesturing to the woman across from Daniel, who nodded crisply. "And this is Marcus Webb, our Director of Operations, and Lily Chen, our Head of Client Relations." "Good to meet you all," Daniel said. His voice came out normal. He was proud of that. "We pulled the meeting forward because we have a contract negotiation scheduled for next Friday, and I want our financial reporting structure locked in before then." Isabella slid a document across the table toward him. "I've outlined our Q4 projections. I'd like your analysis of the tax exposure on the Whitfield deal specifically. And I need a clean picture of our liability structure before we go into that room." Daniel looked at the document. It was dense with numbers, and he understood all of them, and this he could do. This was his ground. "I'll need the subsidiary breakdown and your current depreciation schedule," he said. "Dr. Park will send those this afternoon. Then I can have a preliminary analysis to you by Monday. I need it by Friday morning." He looked up. She was looking at him with the same expression she'd used when she'd handed her card to Bree the night before. Polite, firm, not a negotiation. "Friday morning," he said. "Thank you." She moved to the next item on her agenda without pausing, and Daniel turned his attention to his portfolio and told himself, firmly, that he was a professional, and this was a client meeting, and the rest of it could wait. It waited 45 minutes. The meeting was efficient and dense, and Isabella ran it the way she apparently ran everything, without wasted motion, without unnecessary words, with the kind of quiet authority that people either grew up with or built through years of being underestimated. Dr. Park was sharp and exacting. Marcus Webb kept trying to soften projections, and Isabella kept redirecting him back to accuracy, with a patience that had a definite edge to it. At the end, people gathered their things. Conversation broke into smaller pieces. Dr. Park asking Daniel a follow-up question about quarterly filings. Marcus Webb telling someone across the room to email the Whitfield contract revisions. The room was loud and moving, and Daniel found himself at the door. "Mr. Harper," he turned. Isabella had rolled around the end of the table. The others were occupied. She stopped in front of him and looked up. And this close, away from the performance of the meeting, he could see that the composure was doing some work. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I want you to know that. I didn't know." "I know you didn't." She kept her voice low. "I didn't either. Carol is catastrophically good at meddling. I was going to say thorough, but yes.
She glanced at Dr. Park's retreating back. I want to be clear that this doesn't have to be complicated, he offered. I was going to say weird. It's a little weird. It's extremely weird, she said. And then, almost against her will, the corner of her mouth moved. But not in a bad way. No, he agreed. Not in a bad way. She put her glasses back on, the professional armor reassembled. Friday morning, Mr. Harper. Friday morning, Miss Reyes. He rode the elevator back down to 9, sat at his desk, and stared at his computer for a full 2 minutes before his brain came back online and he started pulling up the Meridian files. He texted Carol at lunch. You knew she was my client. The response came in 4 minutes. I knew you wouldn't go if I told you. That's not an answer. That's exactly an answer. How was it? He put the phone in his drawer. The rest of the day was fine. The work was there, and he did it, and he was good at it. And by 6 o'clock, he had a framework for the Meridian analysis that was, he had to admit, already looking like one of the cleaner pieces of work he'd produced in a while. There was something about having a deadline that came with a face, with a specific person on the other end, that sharpened him. He picked Marcus up from after school, made dinner, helped with homework. Read 2 chapters of a book about a boy who could talk to animals, and that Marcus insisted was realistic. Because what if it was real, Dad? After Marcus was asleep, Daniel sat in the kitchen with his coffee and his laptop and the Meridian files, and worked until 11. He didn't let himself think about anything except the numbers. He was good at that. It was the skill that had saved him in the dark years, the ability to go somewhere the grief couldn't follow, somewhere clean and precise and logical. But at 11, when he closed the laptop, the other thing was still there, waiting. He'd had dinner with a woman for the first time since Rachel. He'd talked, really talked. And he hadn't felt guilty exactly, which he'd always assumed he would. He'd felt sad and glad at the same time, the way certain songs make you feel. The way Marcus laughing could sometimes split Daniel right down the middle, because it sounded so much like his mother. And then he'd walked into a conference room, and she was his client. He picked up his phone. He'd saved her number the night before, Isabella R., and had not yet used it. He looked at it for a moment. Then he typed, For what it's worth, I'm going to be a very professional accountant. He sent it before he could think about it too hard. Watched the 3 dots appear, disappear, appear again. For what it's worth, I'm going to be a very demanding client. He read it twice, then, somehow I'm not surprised. Another pause, then her response. Good night, Daniel. He set the phone down, stood up, walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the city, which was doing what cities do at night. Glowing quietly, going about its business, holding 11,000 private lives inside its lights. Good night, Isabella. The week moved. Daniel worked on the Meridian analysis with the focused intensity of a man with something to prove, although he wasn't entirely sure what or to whom. Doctor. Park sent the subsidiary breakdown Wednesday afternoon, and Daniel cross-referenced it against the depreciation schedule and found 2 things that would need to be addressed: a reporting inconsistency in the 3rd subsidiary, and a liability classification on the Whitfield contract that, if left as written, would create a tax exposure significantly larger than Meridian's projection had accounted for. He sat with that for a moment. It was the kind of finding that could make a client defensive. Nobody liked being told their numbers were wrong. Some clients shot the messenger, and he'd learned long ago to distinguish between the ones who actually wanted to know and the ones who just wanted confirmation. He thought about Isabella in that conference room, the way she'd redirected Marcus Webb back to accuracy without hesitation. The way she'd told Dr. Park, flat and plain, that she wanted a clean picture. Not a comfortable one. A clean one. He wrote the analysis straight.
No softening. No diplomatic cushioning. Clean. He sent it Thursday night, a day early. Friday morning at 7:52, his phone rang. "You sent this last night," Isabella said, without preamble. She was already in full executive mode. He could hear the specific quality of attention in her voice, the kind that didn't have room for pleasantries before the work was done. "I said Friday morning. It's technically Friday morning now. It's 7:52. And here we are." He leaned back in his chair. "Did you read it?" "I've been up since 6. A pause. "The Whitfield exposure. It's real. The way it's currently classified, I know." Her voice had gone flat in a way that wasn't directed at him. "I told legal 3 weeks ago I was concerned about that classification. They said it was standard practice. It's not wrong as a general classification, but given the size of the contract and your current liability load, it creates a gap." She said it quickly, like she'd already worked through it. "How large?" he told her. Silence on the other end. Then, "That's not a small number." "No." Another pause. He could almost hear her thinking. Not the slow, deliberate thinking of someone working through it cold, but the fast, calibrated thinking of someone who already understood the territory and was now just mapping the route. "Can it be restructured before Friday?" "If legal moves quickly, and you're willing to push back on the Whitfield timeline." "I'm not pushing back on Whitfield. I've been building that deal for 8 months. "Then the restructure needs to happen on the liability side. I can walk Dr. Park through the specific adjustments. It's workable, but it needs to happen before you go into that room." "I'll have her call you today." A brief pause. "Daniel." "Yeah?" "This is good work." He didn't say thank you the way he might have with another client. He said, "I know." And he could hear, very faintly, on the other end of the line, that she almost laughed. Dr. Park called at 9. They worked through it for 2 hours, and by 11, the adjustments were drafted, and the exposure had been reclassified in a way that was both accurate and defensible. Daniel walked Dr. Park through the documentation twice, answered every question without impatience, and by the time they got off the phone, he had 17 new emails and a cold cup of coffee and the satisfied, bone-level tiredness of work done right. He went to get lunch. On the way back, passing through the lobby, he ran into Isabella. She was heading toward the elevator bank with a younger woman Daniel didn't recognize. Someone from her team, clearly, based on the speed at which they were moving, and the document the other woman was holding out at a reading angle for Isabella to see. They were mid-conversation, and Isabella was talking, and the other woman was writing something on the document, and it was immediately clear to Daniel that they were not going to stop. He stepped slightly to the side to give them room. As she passed, Isabella glanced up. They made eye contact for exactly 1 second, and in that second, the executive composure shifted, just barely, just at the edges, and she gave him the smallest nod. Not a professional nod, the other kind, the kind that meant, "I see you." He nodded back. She went by. The elevator doors opened and swallowed them, and Daniel stood in the lobby for a moment with his sandwich, aware of an entirely disproportionate warmth in his chest for such a small interaction. He rode back up to 9, got back to work. Did not text her. He did not text her on Saturday either, even though he thought about it twice. He took Marcus to the park, pushed him on the swings until his arms gave out, ate hot dogs from the cart by the fountain, watched his son try to teach a pigeon to shake hands with a seriousness that defied rational explanation. It was a good day, a solid, real, present tense day, and Daniel made himself stay in it. Sunday he cleaned the apartment, did laundry,
helped Marcus build a Lego spaceship that turned into something more like a Lego argument because Marcus kept changing the design mid-build, which Daniel said was against the rules, and Marcus said the rules were suggestions, which was either deeply wrong or slightly correct. Sunday night, after Marcus was asleep, his phone buzzed. "I hope your weekend was good." He looked at it for a long moment. Something about the way she'd signed it, just the initial, like they were already in the habit of something, made his chest do the complicated thing again. It was. "My son tried to teach a pigeon to shake hands."
Did the pigeon cooperate?
The pigeon had opinions. Pigeons always do. A pause. Then, "The Whitfield meeting is Friday. Dr. Park said your analysis saved us a significant problem." I wanted to say that directly. He thought about how to respond. Then, "That's the job." "Yes, but the way you did it. Straight. No padding. That's not always the job. Some people tell you what you want to hear. That's not something I'm good at." "I know." Another pause. I noticed. He set the phone down, picked it up again. "Isabella." "Yes. I'd like to have coffee sometime. Not dinner. Not a date that Carol arranged. Just coffee. If that's something you'd want." The three dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. He was aware of the specific, ridiculous vulnerability of waiting for someone to type. Then, "Tuesday. There's a place on Elm that I've been told is the best in the city." He smiled before he could stop himself, because he knew the place on Elm. The good coffee place. The one he'd gone to on the wrong day that morning, because he was in a mood that he now understood better than he had then. "I know that place. 7:30? 7:30. He put the phone down, leaned back in his chair. The apartment was quiet the way it always was at this hour. The particular quiet of a place where a child was asleep and the rest of the world was doing its thing without him. He'd spent 3 years finding that quiet unbearable, and then just bearable, and then something he'd made his peace with. It occurred to him, sitting there, that he hadn't made his peace with it as much as he'd thought. That there was a difference between peace and numbness, and he'd been calling one thing by the other's name for a long time. On the refrigerator, between Marcus's latest drawing, a superhero with 11 fingers, because Dad, that's how many powers he has, and a magnet from a state park they'd visited in the summer. There was a coffee mug that he'd propped against the door by the handle. Rachel's mug, the one with the chip and the stain. He looked at it from across the room. It had been there for 3 years. It was always there. He'd never questioned it. But tonight, for some reason, he saw it differently. Not as an anchor, not as something holding him in place, but as something that had been holding space for him, keeping a spot open, saying, "You were loved here. That was real. You can carry that and still move." He got up, walked to the kitchen, and held the mug for a moment. The chip in the handle was rough under his thumb, familiar. The stain at the bottom, still there after 100 washes. Like people, Marcus had said. Just worn. Daniel put the mug back on the refrigerator. Then he went to bed. And in the morning, he would wake up and pack a lunch. Peanut butter, no jelly. And drive to work and do his job and not make anything bigger than it was. He was a careful man. He'd always been careful. But Tuesday was coming, and something in him, quiet, tentative, still learning to breathe after years of stillness, was already looking forward to it. He didn't know yet that Tuesday would be the day everything stopped being simple. He didn't know that Tuesday morning, 20 minutes before he arrived at the coffee shop on Elm, Isabella would get a phone call that would crack everything they were carefully building right down the middle. He didn't know what was waiting on the other side of Tuesday, but he showed up anyway, Because that, in the end, was the only thing any of us can do. He was already there when she arrived. That hadn't been planned. Daniel had told himself he would get there at 7:30 on the dot. Professional, measured, not the kind of man who showed up early to a coffee meeting like it was something other than what he'd called it. Just coffee. He'd said, just coffee. But he'd woken up at 6 and couldn't go back to sleep, and Marcus had wanted banana pancakes. And somewhere between the batter and the syrup, Daniel had realized he was in a genuinely good mood, in a way that didn't require analysis. And he dropped Marcus at school 12 minutes early and been at the coffee shop on Elm by 7:15. He'd ordered, found a table near the window, told himself that was just practical. He was reading something on his phone, or doing a passable impression of it, when the door opened and Isabella came in. She was in a burgundy coat today, moving fast, the motorized chair eating up the space between the door and his table with the efficiency of someone who had long ago stopped apologizing for the space she occupied. Her laptop bag was on her lap. Her phone was pressed to her ear. And the expression on her face was the expression Daniel had learned to recognize in the conference room. The one that meant she was listening to something she did not like and processing it at 3 times normal speed. She reached the table, held up one finger, 1 minute, and kept listening. Daniel wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and waited. "No," she said into the phone. Her voice was level, the kind of level that required maintenance. "That's not what the term sheet says, Richard, and you know it's not what the term sheet says. The exclusivity clause runs through the 31st. A pause. "I don't care what he's offering. We are not... Richard." Another pause. Longer. Whatever Richard was saying, it was either complicated or infuriating. And from the particular stillness that came over Isabella's face, Daniel suspected it was both. "I'll call you back in 20 minutes. She lowered the phone, set it on the table face up, looked at Daniel. "Good morning," he said carefully. "Kevin is in Cincinnati," she said. Daniel went very still. "Your Kevin." "I only have one." She pulled off her coat with the practiced motion of someone who'd learned to manage it solo. "He's been in Seattle for 14 months. He left the week after Christmas, and we haven't spoken. And apparently he's been back for 2 weeks and didn't..." She stopped. Her jaw was set. "He reached out to my VP of operations, not to me, to Marcus Webb, to find out if I was seeing anyone." Daniel looked at her steadily. "What did Marcus Webb tell him?" "That it wasn't his business." She almost smiled. "Marcus Webb is occasionally useful." She picked up the menu, even though they were at a coffee shop, and there was essentially one decision to make. And he understood that she was doing it to have something to hold. "He wants to meet. Kevin does. He called my office number this morning and left a voicemail, and Richard, my attorney, is telling me Kevin's also made contact with the Whitfield people." "The Whitfield deal?" Daniel said. "How does Kevin connect to Whitfield?" "He doesn't." She set the menu down. "But his new firm does. He moved to Seattle because he joined a consulting group called Arcturus Partners. And Arcturus Partners," she looked at him, "is Whitfield's secondary vendor for the contract we're about to sign." Daniel sat back. "So if the deal closes, Kevin will be working adjacent to Meridian for the next 18 months minimum." She said it flatly, factually, the way she'd said the accident. "He didn't tell me. He must have known for weeks that our firms were going to be in the same contract space, and he did not tell me. Isabella, I'm fine." She said it quickly, too quickly. Then she seemed to hear herself and exhaled. "I'm not fine, but I will be. I'm just..." She pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of her nose. "I have been putting this contract together for 8 months. This is the biggest deal my company has ever been positioned to close. And now there's this. Does it change anything structurally?" Daniel said. He kept his voice measured, not detached, but steady. Because he understood, in that moment, that what she needed was not someone to match her agitation. She needed someone who could stay level while she worked through it. Legally, professionally, does his involvement with Arcturus create any conflict you can't manage? She looked at him. Some of the agitation shifted into something more focused. No, she said slowly. Not legally.
The contracts are parallel, not integrated. He has no direct role in the Whitfield relationship. His firm is just a secondary vendor. He wouldn't even be in the primary meetings.
Then what's the actual problem? She looked at him for a long moment, and then, in a voice that was quieter than any she'd used so far, I rebuilt everything without him. The whole company. The physical recovery. Learning to do every single thing differently. I did all of it, and I did it because I needed something to be mine. Something he hadn't been part of. Something that didn't have his fingerprints on it. And now he's in Cincinnati, and he's reaching out, and he's in the orbit of the thing that was supposed to be completely mine. Daniel nodded slowly. And, she said, even quieter, I don't know what he wants. He thought about what to say.
He thought about it carefully, because he understood the geography of what she'd just described. The way you build your life back up in the specific shape of someone's absence, and how disorienting it is when that absence suddenly has a presence again. You don't have to know what he wants, Daniel said. Not today. Not before Friday. He left a voicemail. Have you listened to it? She shook her head. Then you don't have to decide anything yet. He leaned forward slightly. You have a meeting in 4 days that you've been building toward for 8 months. You have a legal team. You have an analysis that just reclassified your liability exposure in a way that protects you going in. You have everything you need for Friday. A pause. Kevin is a separate question. He's not separate if he's in the same building. He's not in the same building. He's in a secondary position with a vendor firm. He met her eyes. Isabella, you ran a company from an ICU. You are the last person who needs permission to compartmentalize. Something in her face shifted. The set of her jaw stayed firm, but something around her eyes, the tightness that had been there since she'd walked in, loosened, fractionally. That is a very accountant thing to say. Compartmentalize is an accountant word. You just used it to mean something non-numerical. I'm branching out. She looked at him, and then the almost smile from earlier came back. And this time it didn't stop at almost. It was small and tired and real, and it was the best thing he'd seen all morning. You were here early, she said. I got Marcus to school early. Uh-huh. He wanted banana pancakes. It takes longer than regular pancakes. Daniel. Yeah. You were nervous. He picked up his coffee. I was punctual. You were nervous, and you were here at 7:15, and you've been sitting here with that coffee for 20 minutes. He had absolutely nothing to say to that. He drank his coffee instead. She ordered. They sat. The coffee shop did its morning thing around them. The espresso machine. The low conversation of people who hadn't fully woken up yet. The sound of Cincinnati being a city outside the glass. And slowly, the Isabella who'd come in with the phone to her ear and the controlled panic in her jaw became the Isabella from Rosario's. Still precise, still careful, but present in a way that wasn't armored. Can I ask you something? She said. Yeah. When Rachel died, she paused. Did you ever feel guilty about moving forward? I don't mean moving on, because I think that's a phrase that means nothing. I mean just forward, any direction. He didn't answer right away. He turned the coffee cup in a slow circle on the table.
thinking about what the honest answer was. "For about a year and a half," he said finally.
Every time something was good, Marcus said something funny, or a project came together, or I just had a day that wasn't crushing, there was this immediate secondary feeling. Like, who gave you permission? Like I was enjoying something I hadn't paid for yet. Isabella nodded. She was looking at him with the focused quality of someone who was listening for themselves, not just for politeness. "And then Marcus drew Rachel," Daniel said. "He was 5. He'd been drawing superheroes for weeks, and one day I came home and there was a drawing on the counter. A woman with curly hair and a big smile and a mug in her hand. And he'd written at the top, in 5-year-old letters, 'Mom who make bad coffee,' misspelled. No second F." He stopped. His throat was doing the thing. He let it. And I laughed. I laughed until I cried. And then I just cried. And Marcus came out of his room and patted my arm and said, "It's okay, Dad. She's just somewhere else." And I thought, she would want this. Not because she was saintly or selfless, but because she was practical. She would want Marcus to have a father who was present. And you can't be present while you're standing guard over a feeling. Isabella was quiet for a moment. "Kevin isn't Rachel," she said. "No, he's not." "He left. That's not the same thing." "It's not," Daniel agreed. "But the guilt is similar?" She said it like she was testing the word against something. "The mechanism is similar," he said. "The guilt of forward motion, like it's disloyal to stop hurting." She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. For a moment she looked very young, which was not a thing he'd expected from her, and it made something in his chest shift. "Kevin was my whole plan," she said. "We'd been together for 4 years. I had a timeline. The wedding, the kids we were going to have, the house we were going to buy in Hyde Park. And when he left, I lost. Not just him. I lost the architecture, the whole structure of what my life was supposed to look like." She looked at the table. "And then I built something different, and I told myself I was over the grief of it. But apparently—" Her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at it. Kevin's name was on the screen. She turned it face down. "Apparently, I'm not." "Knowing something and feeling something are different things," Daniel said. "You should put that on a motivational poster." "I don't do posters. I do tax analysis." "And apparently emotional insight." "Carol's influence. She's very communicative." Isabella laughed. It came out a little unsteady, which was how he knew it was real. "I'm going to listen to the voicemail," she said. "Not now. After Friday." "That sounds right." "And I'm going to tell Marcus Webb to stop providing personal information to strangers." "Also sound." "And—" She hesitated. Her hands were still around the mug. "I don't know what the "and" is yet. I just know I'm not going to decide anything while I'm still reacting." "That's the smartest thing I've heard this week," Daniel said. "And I talked to Dr. Park for 2 hours." "High bar," she said dryly. He almost said something then. He almost said what was sitting right there, clear and uncomplicated. That whatever Kevin wanted, whatever this week turned into, he was glad she was here at this table at 7:30 on a Tuesday. That the stone behind his sternum felt different lately. Not gone, but shifted. Like it had moved from the center of something to the edge. That Marcus had said he looked less stuck. And Marcus was 7 years old and generally right about things. He almost said all of it. Then he decided it was too much for Tuesday. Tuesday was already carrying a lot. Instead, he said, "What time is the Whitfield pre-meeting today?" She blinked. 2 o'clock. Why?" "Because I want to make sure the documentation I gave Dr. Park is formatted the way your team needs it. I can adjust the presentation structure if—" "Daniel,"
She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully categorize. You don't have to do that. You've already delivered everything I asked for. I know. I'm offering. She studied him for a moment. You're doing the thing, she said. What thing? The thing where you take care of something practical because there's something emotional you're not ready to say yet. He looked at her. You're going to be a very exhausting person to know. I've been told. She picked up her phone and stood it upright on the table. Kevin's name was still visible through the case. She turned it face down again, deliberately. Then she looked at Daniel. Send me the adjusted format by noon. I'll have Dr. Park review it before the 2 o'clock. Done. And Daniel? Yeah? Thank you. For this morning. She said it plainly, without ceremony. I didn't expect to need this. Good thing I was early, he said. This time, the smile wasn't small at all. He went back to the office. He adjusted the format and sent it by 11:15 because he was, as previously established, a man who showed up before he was required to. He had 4 other clients who needed attention, and he gave it to them because work didn't pause for complicated mornings, and he was glad it didn't. The structure of the day held him while his brain did whatever it was doing underneath the surface, turning things over in the quiet the way a river moves things at the bottom where the current isn't visible from above. At 2:15, Carol called. Kevin's back, she said. No preamble. Carol did not do preamble. I know, Daniel said. A brief silence. She told you. This morning. She... Another pause, and Daniel could almost hear his sister recalibrating. She told you this morning? As in, she talked to you about it? We had coffee. The silence that followed was so loaded, it had its own weather system. Then Carol said, in a carefully controlled voice, You had coffee. Isabella Reyes talked to you about Kevin. The Kevin she hasn't discussed with anyone except me and her therapist since the accident. She mentioned he reached out to Marcus Webb. Daniel. Carol's voice had shifted into something that wasn't quite his sister and wasn't quite his therapist. It was the voice she got when she was genuinely moved by something and trying not to make it a bigger deal than it could handle. She doesn't talk to people. Not really. I mean, she's not unfriendly, but she keeps things in separate rooms. Her work is one room. Her recovery is another room. Her personal life, whatever's left of it, is in a room with the door closed. I noticed, Daniel said. And she talked to you. We talked, Daniel said carefully. About Kevin. Carol was quiet for a moment. What did you say to her? I said she didn't have to decide anything before Friday. A long pause. That's it? Essentially. Daniel Harper, Carol said slowly. For a man who spent 3 years convincing me he was incapable of emotional intelligence, you are doing remarkably well. Don't make it weird. It's already weird. It's been weird since the rain. He could hear the smile in her voice. Are you okay? He thought about it honestly. Yeah, he said. I think I actually am. Good. A pause. She's been... Daniel, when I say she rebuilt herself from nothing, I mean that in a way that is almost hard to watch. She never asked for help. She drove her own recovery with the same intensity she drives her company, and I admire it enormously. And I have also worried about her constantly, because there's a difference between being strong and just never stopping long enough to feel the weight. I know, he said. I know what that's like. I know you do. Carol said it gently. That's why I did this ridiculous, meddling, insufferable thing. You did a ridiculous, meddling, insufferable thing. And... He looked out the window at the October city. And It might have been the right call. Carol made a sound that was either a laugh or a cry or some Tuesday morning combination of the two. Then she said, "Don't mess this up." "Thank you for your confidence." "I have tremendous confidence in you. That's why I'm saying, don't mess it up." He hung up smiling, which was not a thing he'd expected from a call with Carol that involved Kevin and complicated feelings, and a Friday that was still 3 days away. He worked the rest of the afternoon. At 5, he got a text from Isabella. "Pre-meeting went well. Dr. Park's presentation was clean. Thank you for the format adjustment." And then, a minute later, a second message. "I didn't listen to the voicemail." He typed back, "Good." Her response came immediately. "You're not going to tell me I should?" "No." "Why not?" He thought about what Rachel would have said. She'd been direct, in the way of someone who trusted people to handle truth. She'd have said, "Because you'll listen to it when you're ready, and not 1 minute before. And pushing yourself before you're ready is just another way of not actually listening." He didn't say that, because it wasn't his to say. Instead, he typed, "Because you'll know when it's time. You don't need me to tell you." 3 dots. Then, "That's annoyingly reasonable. I have my moments." He put the phone down and went to pick up Marcus. That night, after dinner, after the homework and the bath and the 2 chapters of the animal talking book, after Marcus was asleep with one arm dangling off the side of the bed the way he always slept, always on the edge, as if ready to go somewhere, Daniel sat in the kitchen with the coffee mug and the quiet. He'd been waiting for the guilt to show up. The secondary feeling, the one he'd described to Isabella. Who gave you permission? It hadn't come last Tuesday, and it hadn't come in the conference room, and it hadn't come this morning at the coffee table, with Kevin's name face down on the screen between them. He looked at the mug, the chip, the stain. She's just somewhere else. "Yeah," he said quietly, to no one in particular, to the kitchen, to the quiet, to wherever somewhere else was. He got up and washed his cup, turned off the light, walked down the hall past Marcus's room, paused in the doorway the way he did every night, just to check. The boy was sprawled now, fully diagonal, taking up the entire twin bed, with the chaotic confidence of someone who'd never once worried about taking up space. "Less stuck," Marcus had said. Daniel stood there in the dark doorway and thought about Friday, about Isabella in that conference room, doing the thing she'd been building toward for 8 months, about Kevin in a city he'd come back to without telling her, about the voicemail she hadn't listened to, about the careful, specific way she'd turned the phone face down. He thought about all of it, and what he felt, underneath the complicated, underneath the careful, was something that had been dormant so long it felt like a new muscle. Not hope, exactly. Something quieter than hope, but more durable. The desire to show up. He went to bed. He set his alarm. He slept better than he had in months. And in the morning, he got up and made Marcus pancakes. Regular ones this time, not banana, because he hadn't shopped yet. And drove to school and went to work, and did not try to make any of it larger than it was. But Friday was coming. And when Friday arrived, it didn't bring what any of them had expected. It brought Kevin, in person. In the lobby of the building on 5th and Meridian, standing next to the reception desk in a gray coat, holding a coffee he hadn't touched, looking like a man who had practiced what he was going to say, and had been there for 20 minutes longer than he'd planned. Daniel walked in at 8:45 and saw him before Isabella did. He knew who it was before he knew how he knew. Something in the posture, the deliberate casualness of someone who was not relaxed at all. And then Isabella came out of the elevator. She saw Kevin. Kevin saw Isabella. The lobby did the thing lobbies do, which is go on being a lobby. Elevator chimes, phone calls, people moving past. completely indifferent to the fact that the two people standing 12 feet apart from each other had once been 6 days away from getting married, and one of them had left, and the other had rebuilt the whole world without him. And both of them were now standing in the middle of it. Daniel stopped moving.
He stood by the door and he watched Isabella's face, and he made a choice. Not to step forward, not to step away. Just to stay exactly where he was. Available. Present. Not deciding what this was for her before she'd had the chance to decide it herself. Kevin said her name. Just her name. Izzy. And Isabella Reyes, who had run a company from an ICU bed, who had learned to transfer herself from a car without asking for help, who had turned a phone face down without flinching. Isabella looked at the man who'd left, and for one unguarded second, something moved across her face that Daniel couldn't read and didn't try to. Then she straightened, and her voice, when it came, was perfectly level. "I have a meeting at 9, she said. "You should have called." "I did call," Kevin said. "You didn't answer." "That was information," Isabella said. "You should have understood it." Kevin's jaw tightened. He glanced across the lobby. He saw Daniel. His eyes stayed there for a beat too long. Isabella did not follow his gaze. She kept her eyes on Kevin. "I don't have time for this today," she said. "If you want to talk, call my assistant and schedule something for next week, but not today." Kevin looked at her. He was taller than Daniel had imagined, broader in the shoulder, with a specific look of someone who was used to being the most competent person in a room, and had recently discovered that this was not universal. "I came back because I said not today." She said it without volume, without heat. It was the conference room voice, the one with no room in it. "Kevin." Something in him seemed to deflate, just slightly. "Okay," he said. "Okay. Next week." He looked across the lobby one more time. Daniel met his eyes briefly, without expression, without claim. Just a man standing near a door. Then Kevin walked out. The lobby went on being a lobby. Isabella turned her chair toward the elevator. As she passed Daniel, she slowed, just slightly, just enough. "You saw," she said. It wasn't a question. "I saw," he said. She nodded. Her jaw was set, but her eyes were clear. "I'll call you after 9, she said. He nodded. "I'll be at my desk." She went to her meeting. Daniel went to his office, and the building on 5th and Meridian held both of them inside its 14 floors, each of them doing the work that was in front of them, which was the only honest thing either of them knew how to do. But something had shifted in the lobby. Something had landed, and neither of them, going about their Friday mornings, was entirely the same person they'd been walking in. She called at 9:47. Daniel picked up on the second ring. He'd been at his desk since 8:50, not pretending to work, actually working. The Whitmore Quarterly, 2 other client files, a response to an IRS inquiry that required careful language. But some part of him had been listening for the phone the whole time. "The Whitfield meeting went well," she said. No greeting. She'd never been a person who opened with pleasantries when there was substance to get to. He'd noticed that and decided early on that he liked it. "They accepted the revised liability structure. We're signing the full contract next Thursday." "Congratulations," Daniel said. And he meant it the way he meant things, not as a social reflex, but as a genuine recognition of what 8 months of work looked like when it finally landed. "Thank you." A pause. Not the kind that meant she was done. The kind that meant she was deciding whether to go further. "He came to the building, Daniel." "I know. I was there." "I know you were there." Another pause. "How much did you hear?" Not much. I stayed by the door. It wasn't my conversation. He could hear her exhale. He looked at you. He did. What did he see? Daniel thought about how to answer that. A man standing near a door, he said. That's what I thought. She was quiet for a moment. He looked at you like he was trying to figure out what you were to me. What did you want him to figure out? She didn't answer immediately. He waited because he'd learned that her silences were not empty. They were where she kept the honest things while she decided if she could say them out loud. I don't know yet, she said finally. And I'm not going to pretend I do. That's fair. I listened to the voicemail, she said, this morning, before I came downstairs. I sat in the elevator and I listened to it. He didn't say anything. Let her come to it at her own speed. He said he never stopped thinking about me. That leaving was the worst decision he ever made. That scene Meridian come up in the Whitfield paperwork made him realize. She stopped. Her voice had stayed controlled, but just barely, and he could hear the effort in it. He said he realized he'd been waiting for the right time to reach out, and that there was never going to be a right time. So he came back. Daniel kept his voice steady. What did you feel when you heard it? A long pause. Angry, she said. And sad. And something else that something I can't fully name yet. She made a short sound that wasn't quite a laugh. 14 months. He couldn't be in the room with me in a wheelchair. He couldn't figure out how to be someone's partner when that person's life had fundamentally changed. And he's had 14 months in Seattle to become somebody who could. And maybe he has. And maybe that's real. And She stopped again. I don't know what to do with that. You don't have to know today, Daniel said. You keep saying that. It keeps being true. Daniel. Her voice shifted into something that was harder to read. Not the executive voice, not the careful social voice, but something underneath both. Can I ask you something that might be uncomfortable? Yeah. When you saw him in the lobby, when you saw the way I looked at him, she paused. Did it change anything for you? He was quiet for a moment. The honest answer was complicated, so he gave it the space it needed. It told me that this is real, he said. What you had, what you lost. That's not nothing, and I'm not going to treat it like it is. He looked at the window. But no, it didn't change what I think about you, or what I think about this. This, she repeated, as if testing the word. Whatever this is, he said, which I'm also not going to pretend I have fully categorized. A beat. Then, we're both terrible at this. We're both out of practice, he corrected. That's different. She made a sound, soft, tired, real. I need a few days, she said. Not because of you, because of me. I need to think through the Kevin piece without it bleeding into, she paused, into the other piece. Take whatever time you need, he said. I'm not going anywhere. You don't know that. I know it well enough. He let that sit for a moment. The Whitfield contract closes Thursday. That's good work, Isabella. Whatever else is happening, that's yours. A long pause. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. Thank you for being in the lobby this morning, even though you didn't do anything. Sometimes that's the thing, he said. She hung up. He put the phone down. He looked at the window for a while. Then he went back to the Whitmore Quarterly, because the work was there and it needed to be done. And being a person who showed up for the ordinary things was, he had come to understand, not separate from being someone who showed up for the extraordinary ones. It was the same muscle. You built it on Tuesdays and Wednesdays,
so it was there when Friday came. The next 3 days were quiet, in the way that loaded things are quiet before they resolve. He texted her once on Saturday. Nothing significant, just a photo Marcus had drawn of what he'd called a superhero who uses a go-kart, which was clearly, to any adult eye, a wheelchair with a lightning bolt on it, and which Marcus had drawn of his own accord without any prompting, because he was 7, and had been told about Isabella in the most general possible terms, and his brain had immediately recruited her for his fictional universe. Isabella's response came 30 minutes later. "I want this framed." Then, "He's remarkable." Then, after another minute, "Like his dad." Daniel looked at that last message for a long time. He didn't overthink it. He just let it be what it was. He took Marcus to Carol's for Sunday dinner, which was a monthly ritual that Marcus treated as a religious event, because Carol made pot roast and let him stay up past his bedtime playing card games. Carol pulled Daniel into the kitchen while Marcus was setting the table, with the extreme concentration of someone who'd been told the forks go on the left and had taken this as a personal mission. "How are you?" Carol asked. She was stirring something and not looking at him, which was how she asked questions she actually wanted answered. "I'm good," he said. "Kevin showed up." "I know. I was there." She turned to look at him. "You were there when he came to the building?" "I was in the lobby." Carol studied him with the specific intensity of someone who had known him for 40 years and could read him like a document she'd proofread multiple times. "And how was that?" "Informative," he said. "Daniel." "It told me things about both of us that I think I needed to know." He leaned against the counter. She handled it. She handled it the way she handles everything, cleanly and without asking for backup. But she knew I was there. Carol looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to her pot. "Kevin Marsh is a man who discovered what he lost after he'd already thrown it away," she said quietly. "That's a specific kind of pain, and I don't wish it on anyone. But Isabella spent 14 months becoming something she wasn't before, and not all of it was about him." "I know," Daniel said. "She's not the same person he left," Carol said. "And he doesn't fully know that yet. He's coming back for the person he remembers." She paused. "You know the person she is now." He didn't say anything. He looked at his hands on the counter. "That matters," Carol said. "It doesn't solve everything, but it matters." Marcus appeared in the doorway. "The forks are ready. Can I have a roll?" "One roll," Carol said, without turning around. "Dinner's in 10 minutes." Marcus took his roll and disappeared. Carol shook her head with the fond exasperation of someone who'd had 40 years of practice with Harper men and their quiet emotions and their inability to ask for rolls properly. "She's going to have to deal with Kevin directly," Daniel said. "I know. And whatever that is, whatever comes out of it, she has to get there herself." "I know that too." Carol looked at him over her shoulder. "What I'm asking is how you are while she does." He thought about Rachel's mug on the refrigerator, Marcus's drawing, the rain, Isabella's hand in his outside a restaurant, a second longer than a handshake required. "I'm okay," he said. "I mean it." Carol nodded, turned back to the stove. "Good," she said. "Set the table. You're helping." Monday morning, he had a message from Dr. Park confirming the Thursday contract signing and requesting the final audit documentation by Wednesday noon. He sent it Tuesday morning instead, complete and clean, because Wednesday noon was always better served by Tuesday morning if you had it in you. Tuesday afternoon, Isabella appeared at his office. He hadn't been expecting her. Jenny had knocked and said there was a Ms. Reyes asking if he had 10 minutes, and Daniel had said yes before he'd fully processed it. And then Isabella was in his doorway, in a dark coat, with her hair down, which he'd never seen before. And something about that small difference made her look simultaneously more formidable and more like someone who was trying. "I should have called," she said. "It's fine. Come in." She came in. He closed the door. She didn't park herself in the middle of the room the way most people did when they visited his office. She went to the window, which is what he did when he was thinking through something and needed to be facing something that wasn't another person. "I met with Kevin yesterday," she said. He sat on the edge of his desk and waited. "He came to my office, properly this time, through my assistant, scheduled, 20 minutes. She was looking out the window. He said everything he said in the voicemail, but in person, and with more detail, and—" She paused. "And it was different hearing it face to face. Because I could see him while he said it, and I could see that he meant it." "What did you say?" "I said that I believed him." She turned slightly. "And then I said that I didn't know what to do with that." "How did he respond?" "He said he wasn't asking me to do anything right now, that he just wanted me to know that he understood what he'd done, that he'd spent a lot of time on it." She was quiet for a moment. "He looked different. He looked—" She seemed to search for the word. "Smaller. Not in a bad way, in the way people look when they've lost some arrogance they didn't know they had." Daniel looked at her. "Did it change how you feel about him?" She turned to face him fully. Her expression was the careful one, the one that was doing work, but her eyes were direct. "I felt grief," she said. "Real grief, for the first time in a long time. Not anger, not the controlled managing of it. Actual grief. For what we had. For the wedding that didn't happen. For the version of my life that went away with him." She paused. "And then I felt something else." "What?" "Relief," she said. "Because I realized I'd been holding all of that at arm's length for 14 months. Processing it in clinical terms with my therapist, reframing it as strength, turning it into fuel for the company, doing everything I knew how to do with hard feelings, except actually feel them." She looked at him steadily. "I cried in my office after he left. Ugly crying. Dr. Park walked in and walked straight back out again. And I don't think either of us will ever acknowledge that it happened." Despite himself, Daniel almost smiled. "And when it was done," Isabella continued, "I felt— lighter is the wrong word. More honest, maybe. Like I'd put down something I'd been carrying as a shape I didn't fully understand." She came closer to where he was sitting on the edge of the desk. "I told him I wasn't going to make any decisions about anything, that I needed time. He said he understood. He left." "How do you feel now?" Daniel asked. "Like myself," she said, "which is not a small thing." He looked at her. She was standing close enough that he could have reached out, and he didn't, because she was still in the middle of saying something, and he was learning to read her the way you learn any complicated language. Slowly, with attention, without rushing the grammar. "Daniel," she said, "I need you to know something." "Okay." "Whatever happens with Kevin, whatever I end up deciding, whatever that process looks like, it's mine to work through. It's not something you can help me with, and it's not something that reflects on what I think about—" She stopped, started again. "I'm not the kind of woman who keeps two things going at once and tells herself they're separate. That's not who I am." "I know," he said. "So I need to be honest about where I am." She looked at him directly. "I am somewhere in the middle of something. I am not available in the ways that I would want to be available to someone that I—" She stopped again. Something in her face shifted, the professional composure bending at the edges. "Someone I think about more than is professionally advisable," she finished. He looked at her for a long moment. "That's the most careful compliment anyone has ever given me," he said. "I'm a careful person." "I know." He stood up from the desk. They were nearly the same height now, with her in the chair and him standing, which was a geometry he'd stopped noticing sometime around the third meeting.
"I'm not asking for anything from you right now, Isabella. I'm not asking you to decide anything or be anywhere you're not." He meant it, and she could hear that he meant it, which was the thing about two people who had both had enough loss to know the difference between honesty and performance. "I'm just glad you came to tell me." She looked at him for a beat longer than the sentence required. Then she nodded, once, with a definiteness that was its own kind of affection. "The contract signing is Thursday," she said, reassembling the day around them. "I know. Congratulations again." "You'll be there. Dr. Park requested your firm be represented." "I'll be there." "Good." She started for the door. Then she stopped, with her back to him, and said without turning around, "The drawing Marcus did. The superhero in the go-kart." "Yeah?" "Tell him she can go 60 miles an hour, and she uses it to fight crime." He laughed. The real one. The one that came up from somewhere unexpected. "He's going to love that." "Good." She went to the door and paused with her hand on the frame, not looking back. "Thank you, Daniel, for all of it." "That's what I'm here for," he said. And she went, and the office was quiet. And Daniel stood there for a moment, in the specific silence of someone who has just been trusted with something real and knows enough to treat it carefully. He sat back down at his desk. He had work to do. He did it. The afternoon moved through its ordinary hours. Emails, a conference call, a filing that needed to go out before 5. And he moved with it, present in the way he'd been learning to be present again. Not numb, not guarded, just there. That evening, making dinner while Marcus talked at approximately 300 words per minute about a kid at school who claimed to have seen a real fox in his backyard, Daniel found himself thinking not about Kevin or Whitfield or the complicated geometry of what was happening on the 14th floor. He was thinking about something Isabella had said. "Like myself," which is not a small thing. He understood that. More than he could have told her, he understood that. He'd spent 3 years getting back to himself, the version of himself that wasn't just a man maintaining a routine, but a man who was actually present inside his own life. He wasn't all the way there, he didn't think, but he was further than he'd been. And he knew, with a quietness that didn't need to be announced, that the last 2 weeks had something to do with that. "Dad," Marcus said, "are you listening?" "The fox," Daniel said. "Your friend saw a fox." I said maybe it was a coyote, because foxes are smaller. That's accurate. How do you know if something is a fox or a coyote? The tail, Daniel said. Foxes have bigger, bushier tails. Marcus considered this with deep seriousness. What if the coyote had a big tail? Then it would be a confusing coyote. Marcus laughed. He had his mother's laugh. Not the sound of it, but the quality, the way it was always slightly surprised by itself, like joy kept catching him off guard. Daniel stood at the stove and listened to it, and felt the stone behind his sternum. Present, still, always there, but occupying less of the space than it used to. Shifted to one side, making room. He served dinner. They ate. He helped with reading homework and negotiated the bedtime and the number of acceptable glasses of water after lights out, which Marcus always treated as an opening position in a negotiation, and which Daniel matched with the same energy, because some battles were worth having, if only for the practice. After Marcus was asleep, he sat with his coffee in the kitchen and thought about Thursday. The contract. The building. The 14th floor and the 9th floor, and the specific unlikely fact that the woman who'd had her wheel jammed in a sidewalk crack in the rain
was also the most significant professional client he'd ever taken on, and was also someone who had made him laugh at a restaurant until it felt like something in him had come loose, in the right way, for the first time in 3 years and 2 months. He thought about Kevin Marsh, somewhere in the city, having said his honest thing and been told to wait. He thought about what Carol had said. She's not the same person he left. You know the person she is now. He didn't know if that was enough. He didn't know if any of it was enough. He was 44 years old, and he'd loved one woman completely and lost her, and spent 3 years rebuilding around the absence, and he wasn't sure he was ready, and he wasn't sure he was not ready, and both of those things were true at the same time. But the desire to show up was there, still there. Quiet and durable, the way he'd felt it the night in the rain. The way a man feels when he throws open a car door without quite deciding to, because some part of him already knows. Thursday was coming, and Thursday he would find out whether the ground that had been shifting quietly beneath all of them was going to settle or crack wide open. Thursday arrived the way important days always do, without ceremony, without any external signal that this particular morning was different from the ones before it. The alarm went off at 6:15. Daniel made coffee. He packed Marcus's lunch: peanut butter, no jelly, an apple, and a note that said, "Superhero fuel," because Marcus had asked him to start doing that, and Daniel had decided that was a reasonable request. He drove Marcus to school, kissed the top of his head, watched him run through the door without looking back, the way 7-year-olds do, because the world ahead of them is always more interesting than the world behind. Then he drove to the building on 5th and Meridian and rode the elevator up to 9 and put on the charcoal blazer he'd worn to Rosario's, which was the only good blazer he owned, and which had by now accumulated enough significance that it felt almost like armor. The contract signing was at 2 o'clock, in the conference room on 14. Dr. Park had sent the final documentation at 7 that morning, with a note that was, for Dr. Park, almost effusive. "Clean and complete. Thank you." He reviewed it one more time, found nothing wrong, closed the file. At 11, his phone buzzed. Not Isabella. Carol. "Today's the day. You okay?" He typed back, "Ask me at 3. Her response, "I'll be asking at 2:30. I don't have patience." He set the phone down and tried to focus on the Morrison audit, which was a reasonable piece of work that deserved his attention and was getting approximately 40% of it. At 12:30, Jenny knocked. "There's something at the front desk for you." He went out. On the reception counter, next to Jenny's coffee and her stack of pending files, was a paper cup from the place on Elm. No name on it, just a small piece of paper folded once around the sleeve. He unfolded it. Good coffee for a man who shows up early. He stood there, holding the cup for a moment, aware of Jenny watching him with the discreet attention of someone who had worked for him for 4 years and had a very complete picture of his emotional landscape. "Do you know who brought this?" he asked. "A young woman from upstairs," Jenny said. "She didn't leave a name." He took the coffee back to his office. He sat down. He drank it slowly, and it was, as advertised, very good. At 1:55, he rode the elevator up to 14. The conference room was already full when he walked in. Dr. Park, Marcus Webb, Lily Chen, 2 attorneys from the Whitfield side, a representative from Arcturus Partners, whose name Daniel didn't catch, and at the head of the table, Isabella, in a deep blue blazer that was the same shade as the raincoat from 3 weeks ago. She was talking to one of the Whitfield attorneys, and she didn't look up when Daniel came in, but the Arcturus representative did. And 2 seats down from the Arcturus representative, also looking up, was Kevin Marsh. Daniel had expected this. Not specifically. He hadn't known Kevin would be in the room, but the possibility had been there, in the back of everything, since the lobby on Friday. He'd had 5 days to sit with it. He was sat with it. He found his seat on the Harper accounting side of the table, opened his portfolio, and looked at the documentation. He was here as a professional. The professional thing was to act like one, and he was genuinely good at that, and so he did it.
Kevin Marsh was in his early 40s, well-built, with the kind of face that was probably described as trustworthy in professional settings. He was watching Daniel with the same focused assessment from the lobby, still trying to map the territory, still working out what category Daniel belonged in. Daniel gave him a brief, neutral nod. Professional acknowledgement, nothing more. Kevin nodded back. His jaw was slightly tight. Isabella called the room to order at 2 o'clock precisely. If she had registered the specific geometry of who was sitting where, none of it showed. She was entirely in the executive voice. Clear, authoritative, structured, and Daniel watched her run the room the way he'd watched her the first time, with the same combination of admiration and something warmer that he'd stopped trying to classify. The signing took 40 minutes. There were points of clarification on the liability structure, which Daniel fielded from his end with the directness that Isabella had noted and appreciated, and a minor back and forth about the timeline for deliverables, which Isabella handled with a patience that had an edge and the edge that had a limit. And when Marcus Webb tried to soften a deadline the way he always did, Isabella looked at him with a single expression, and he stopped trying. Kevin spoke twice, both times on behalf of Arcturus, both times competently, and both times with a careful neutrality toward the Meridian side of the table that cost him something visible. He knew what this room was. He knew what this contract represented for her. Daniel could see him understanding that in real time, the full scope of what Isabella had built in the time since he'd left, and doing the arithmetic on it in a way that looked like it hurt. The contracts were signed at 2:41. The room did what rooms do after big things are completed. It exhaled. People gathered papers, shook hands, exchanged the measured warmth of professionals who had just done something real together. Dr. Park produced a bottle of sparkling water from somewhere and poured it into glasses with the efficiency of someone who had prepared for this moment and was not going to waste it on sentiment. Daniel was talking to one of the Whitfield attorneys when he saw, at the periphery of his vision, Kevin cross the room toward Isabella. He didn't move. He kept his attention on the attorney and kept his voice on the question being asked, something about quarterly reporting schedules, and answered it fully and correctly. But he was aware. Of course he was aware. Kevin stopped beside Isabella's chair. He said something quietly, and whatever it was, Isabella listened to it without the conference room voice, without the composure that required maintenance. She looked up at him with the plain, honest face she only used when she wasn't performing anything. Then she said something back, just a few words, and Kevin nodded once. A slow nod, the kind that means, I understand, and it's not what I wanted, simultaneously. And he stepped back. He shook her hand, which was, Daniel thought, the saddest possible thing a man could do to a woman he'd planned to marry, and walked out of the conference room without looking at Daniel at all. 3 minutes later, the rest of the room began to clear. Daniel packed his portfolio. He said goodbye to Dr. Park, who shook his hand with the crisp formality of someone who respected him and would probably never say so directly, which was fine. He said goodbye to Marcus Webb, who had finally started smiling now that the contract was signed and the deadlines were set, and he could relax his instinct to soften things. He was nearly at the door when Isabella said his name. The room was mostly empty. Just Lily Chen packing up at the far end of the table, and one of the attorneys on his phone in the corner. "Walk with me," she said. They went out into the hall,
past the reception desk, toward the far end of the floor, where the windows looked south over the city. This part of 14 was quieter. A small seating area, 2 chairs and a low table. The kind of space that existed for the human moments that offices didn't have official rooms for. She stopped there. He stood. "Kevin asked me to have dinner with him," she said. Daniel kept his face where it was. "I said no," she said. He looked at her. "I said no, and I need you to know that I didn't say it because of you." She met his eyes directly. "I said it because of me. Because I've spent 14 months becoming someone who makes decisions from the inside out, not the outside in. And from the inside, the answer is no." She paused. "He's not a bad man."
He was a frightened man who made a bad decision, and he spent a year and a half living with it. And I believe him when he says he's sorry. But sorry isn't the same as right. And going back isn't the same as going forward. "Isabella, let me finish," she said it gently. "I need to say all of it." She took a breath. "You showed up in the rain. That sounds like the setup to something corny, and maybe it is, but it's also just factually true. You showed up, and I didn't ask you to, and you didn't make it about yourself. And every time something complicated has happened in the last 3 weeks, you have been exactly as present as the moment required, and no more. You didn't push. You didn't claim anything that wasn't yours to claim." She looked at him with the careful eyes that had been cataloging him since the sidewalk. "That's rare. I've been around enough people to know that's genuinely rare." He listened. He let her say it. "I'm not completely sorted," she said. "I want to be honest about that. The Kevin piece. It's processed, I think, but processed and finished are not always the same thing. And I'm not going to tell you I'm fully on the other side of it, because I don't know if that's true yet." She paused. "But I know what I want. I know who I want to spend time with. And I'm done waiting until everything is resolved and clean to say so. Because I have learned, the hard way, that resolved and clean is a thing you wait for forever." Daniel looked at her. The seating area at the end of the 14th floor of a glass building in Cincinnati was not Rosario's. The light was office light, not candlelight. And there was no rain outside, and no jazz, and no tiramisu. But he thought he might remember this moment longer than all of those things. "Marcus drew you a new picture," he said. She blinked. What?" "Last night. I told him what you said, about the 60 miles an hour and fighting crime. He sat at the kitchen table for 45 minutes and drew you the most detailed wheelchair superhero I have ever seen, which, admittedly, is a small sample size, but still." He looked at her steadily. "He wants to know if she has a name." Isabella stared at him. Something in her face moved. Not the careful composure, not the executive, not the woman who ran meetings from the head of the table, but the real one, the one he'd seen pieces of over soup and wine, and bad coffee, and coffee shop tables, and lobby goodbyes. "He drew me a superhero," she said. "He takes these things seriously." "She needs a name," Isabella said. Her voice was doing the thing. She didn't try to stop it. Tell him her name is Isabel. And she can fly, actually. The go-kart is just when she wants to be closer to the ground." Daniel smiled. He couldn't help it and didn't try to. He's going to need to add wings. He seemed resourceful. She looked at him. "I want to meet him. He's going to have approximately 700 questions. I have answers for approximately 700 questions. He's going to ask about the chair." "Good," she said. "I'd rather he ask than wonder." She was looking at him with an openness that was new, not the guard down exactly, because he didn't think Isabella Reyes would ever be entirely without a guard,
and he didn't need her to be. But the guard was resting, at ease. "I'd like to come to dinner sometime, if that's something you'd want." He thought about his kitchen, the refrigerator with the drawings and the mug, the small table with the 4 chairs, 2 of which were always empty. Marcus, with his 11-fingered superheroes, and his questions about heaven, and his very clear-eyed assessment of when his father was stuck. "Saturday," Daniel said. "I'll make pasta. Marcus will perform, because he performs for any audience he can get, and I apologize in advance." "I love an audience that performs," she said. "He's going to show you every drawing he's ever made." "I have time." "You say that now." "Daniel." She said his name the way she had at Rosario's, the first time, when she'd held out her hand in the rain and he'd shaken it with a soaking wet grip. And he'd thought, this person is someone. "I have time," she said again, and she meant it in the bigger sense, and he heard it in the bigger sense. And the space between them in the hallway on the 14th floor held it. "Saturday," he said. 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock, she said. They rode down in the elevator together. She pressed 9 for him without being asked, the way you do for someone whose floor you've memorized without deciding to. And at 9, she said goodbye, and he got off, and the doors closed, and he stood in the hall outside his office for a moment, just standing, just breathing, the way you do when something has shifted, and you need a second to let your footing catch up to the new ground.
Jenny looked up from her desk, took in his expression, said nothing, which was one of the many things Daniel had always appreciated about Jenny. He went to his office. He sat down. He called Carol. She picked up before the first ring was finished. "How did it go?" "The contract signed," he said. "I know the contract signed. Marcus Webb sent a group text to half the physical therapy department for some reason. How did it go?" "She's coming to dinner Saturday," he said. The sound Carol made was not dignified. He let her have it. 6 o'clock, he added. "She's going to meet Marcus." "He's going to love her," Carol said, slightly unsteadily. "I know." "And she's going to love him." "I know that too." He paused. "Carol?" "Yeah?" "Thank you. For the blind date you completely failed to disclose any relevant information about." "You're welcome," she said, with the satisfaction of someone who had been waiting 3 years to hear those 2 words in that specific order. "I'm going to remind you of this forever." "I assumed. I'm going to tell this story at your wedding." "Let's not. I'm going to describe the rain in detail. I'm going to mention the umbrella." "Carol." "I'm going to cry while I'm saying it." "I'm hanging up now," Daniel said. "You love me." "Goodbye, Carol." He hung up. He sat there for a moment with the phone in his hand, and the afternoon coming through the window, and the city going about its business the way it always did, indifferent and alive. Then he picked up a pen and got back to the Morrison audit, because there was still an hour before he needed to leave to get Marcus, and the work was there, and he was a man who finished what he started. He was also, he was beginning to understand, a man who was starting something. That Saturday, at 6 o'clock, Isabella knocked. Actually knocked, because Daniel had realized the building's front door presented a practical challenge, and had gone down to meet her. And she'd looked at him when he appeared in the lobby, and said with complete composure, "I had it handled," even though she visibly hadn't. And he'd said, "I know," and held the door anyway, and she'd let him, which he understood was its own kind of statement. Marcus was waiting at the apartment door in his best superhero pajamas, which was, Daniel had decided, not worth correcting, holding a drawing rolled up in his hand like a scroll. He presented it to Isabella with the gravity of someone conferring an honor. She unrolled it. The wheelchair superhero, Isabel, 60 miles per hour, crime fighter, now with wings that Marcus had rendered in blue and gold crayon,
with an ambition that slightly exceeded the technical execution, looked back at her from the page.
At the bottom, in Marcus's blocky 7-year-old letters, "For Isabella, who is brave." Isabella looked at it for a long time. "It's very accurate," she said finally. Marcus beamed. "I used blue because that's the color of fast things." "That's exactly right," she said. "That is the color of fast things. Do you want to see my other drawings?" "I was hoping you'd ask," she said. Dinner was pasta and garlic bread, and a salad that Marcus regarded with open suspicion, but ate a reasonable portion of, under Daniel's patient negotiation. Marcus talked for most of the meal, about his drawings, about school, about the fox that might have been a coyote, about a book he was reading, about a dream he'd had where he could understand animal languages, but only if the animals were speaking Spanish, which he said was unfair because he was only on chapter 3 of his Spanish workbook. Isabella listened to all of it. Not politely, actually listened, the way she listened to everything, with her full attention, asking the follow-up questions that showed she'd heard the previous answer. She told Marcus that her chair could go fast, but she'd never tested the exact miles per hour, and Marcus said they should time it, and she said that was a reasonable experiment, and Daniel watched his son's face and felt the stone behind his sternum. Still there, still real, still Rachel's, but settled in a way it hadn't been in 3 years. Not gone, not forgotten, just finally in its right place, which was the past, which was also permanent and also loved, and which did not require him to live there anymore. After dinner, Marcus showed every drawing, every single one. Isabella examined each with the focused attention she brought to quarterly reports and contract negotiations, and her comments were specific and genuine, and Marcus glowed with the particular light of a child who has been taken seriously by an adult they've decided to admire. At 8:30, Daniel put Marcus to bed. The full production of it, the 2 chapters, the glass of water that was really an opening bid, the tuck-in with the arm already dangling off the edge. At the door, Marcus said, quietly enough that it was meant for Daniel alone, "She's nice, Dad." "Yeah," Daniel said. "She is." "Is she going to come back?" He looked at his son in the low light of the nightlight, the small face already going soft towards sleep. "Yeah, bud," he said. "I think she is." Marcus nodded, like this was the answer he'd expected, and closed his eyes and was asleep in 4 minutes, the way only the young and the untroubled can be. Daniel came back to the kitchen. Isabella was at the counter with a cup of tea she'd made herself, which he hadn't asked her to, and she hadn't asked permission for, and that small domestic confidence was maybe the most clarifying thing he'd seen all evening. She looked up when he came in. "He's remarkable," she said. The same thing she'd texted, said differently now, with the full weight of the evening behind it. "He is," Daniel said. "He gets it from his mother." "He gets some of it from his mother," Isabella said carefully. He looked at her. "He watches you," she said. "The way he looked at you when you laughed at the coyote story. He was watching to see if you were actually happy." She held the teacup in both hands. "He is very carefully taking care of you. That's not his mother. That's a boy who learned it from someone." Daniel had nothing to say to that. He stood in his kitchen and felt it, the fullness of it, the complicated, layered, unresolved, and still somehow complete shape of this moment, this woman, this apartment, this life he was still in the middle of building. "I want to be clear about something," he said. She waited. "I'm not fully there yet either. I meant it when I said it, and I mean it now. Rachel was real. And Marcus carries her, and so do I. That doesn't go away." He met her eyes. "But it doesn't close the door, and I need you to know
that I know the difference between using someone to fill a space and choosing someone because you're. He stopped, started again more honestly. Because you are exactly who you are, which is someone I want to know. Isabella looked at him steadily, the careful eyes, the jaw that had slowly, over 3 weeks in a rainstorm and 2 floors of the same building, and a 7-year-old with a scroll drawing and a cup of tea made without permission, finally stopped working so hard. I know the difference too, she said. He crossed the kitchen. He sat down across from her at the small table with the 4 chairs. They talked for another hour. Not about Kevin, not about Rachel, not about the contract or the building or any of the complicated architecture of how they'd arrived here. They talked the way they'd talked at Rosario's, in the first hour before everything got complicated and real. Easy. Present. 2 people who had each been through enough to know that this, the ordinary, warm, unglamorous fact of being in a room together and not wanting to be anywhere else, was not a small thing. It was not a small thing at all. At 10, she said she should go. He walked her down. In the lobby, she turned and looked at him with the expression he'd come to understand was her honest face. The one underneath all the others. Next Saturday, she said. Let me cook. My place. I should warn you that I've been told I make excellent pasta, so you should prepare for a direct comparison. That sounds like a challenge, he said. It's a standing invitation, she said. There's a difference. He smiled. Next Saturday. She went. He stood in the lobby and watched until she was in the car, and the door had closed, and the modified sedan had pulled out into the street, and the city had absorbed her, the way cities absorb everyone, folding them into the ongoing, ordinary, extraordinary fact of being alive in a place. He rode back up to 9, walked down the hall, stood in his doorway for a moment, the way he stood in Marcus's doorway every night, just to confirm that the thing he cared about was still there and still safe. The apartment was quiet. The nightlight glowed under Marcus's door. The refrigerator held the drawings and the mug with the chip and the stain that would never fully wash out. Like people, Marcus had said, just worn. Daniel Harper walked into his kitchen, poured himself the last of the coffee, and stood at the window and looked at his city. Cincinnati at 10 o'clock on a Saturday in October. Lit and breathing, and going about the 10,000 private lives that cities hold without asking. And he felt, clearly and without qualification, that he was glad to be in it. Glad to be standing in this kitchen, in this life, with its grief and its small drawings, and its unanswered questions, and its next Saturday already on the calendar. He was not finished grieving. He was not finished being careful. He was not at the end of anything complicated. But he was here, and he was present. And the door that had been closed for 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days was open. He had opened it himself. That was the thing nobody tells you about the hardest part of loss. That the door doesn't open from the outside. No one can open it for you. Not a sister with a matchmaking habit and a moral certainty that she knows best. Not a chance encounter in a rainstorm. Not a blind date at an Italian restaurant or a conference room on the 14th floor. Or a child who draws superheroes with 11 fingers. All of those things can stand outside it and knock. But only you can decide to let them in. Daniel Harper had been a man standing at a closed door for 3 years. And then, one October night, in the rain, he threw open a car door without quite deciding to, because some part of him already knew. And he crossed the street, and he held out his hand, and he said, "I've got you." He had no idea when he said it that she would say the same thing back to him. Not in those words, but in every word after them. He finished his coffee, rinsed the cup, turned off the kitchen light, walked down the hall, and paused at Marcus's door, arms still dangling, still ready to go somewhere, and then went to his own room and got into bed. He did not look at the empty pillow. He looked at the ceiling, and he thought about next Saturday, and he slept. Some stories begin with a tragedy. Some begin with a choice. Some begin in the rain on the Thursday night with a woman whose wheel is caught in a crack in the sidewalk and a man who almost kept driving. Daniel Harper did not keep driving, and that made all the difference.